Thank you very much and welcome again to the Literary Translation Centre. I'm Boyd Tonkin, I'm the literary editor of The Independent, and we're here to discuss the shortlist for this year's Independent Foreign Fiction Prize. And I'm really pleased to, that with me today are two of our judges for this year's prize, Gabriel Josipovici and Elif Shafak, both of them distinguished novelists and very eminent critics as well. And just to give credit where it's due to the two other judges of the prize who can't be here, who are Jean Boersbeyer and Frank Wynne. Now, as always, we have a wonderful shortlist for this year's prize, chosen from just under 100 novels. And probably before we talk about them in detail, I ought to just remind those of you who don't know who is on the shortlist this year. This is in no particular order, but I'll go through them, giving the name of the author and, of course, the name of the translator, just as important as well. So we have The Fall of the Stone City by Ismail Kadare, translated by John Hodgson and published by Canongate. We have Dublinesque by Enrique Villamatas, translated by Rosalind Harvey and Anne MacLean and published by Harvel Secker. We have Trieste by Dasha Dernditch, translated by Ellen Elias Bursach and published by Maclehose Press. There is also The Detour by Gerbrand Bakker, translated by David Colmer and published also by Harvel Secker. The fifth one is Traveller of the Century by Andres Neumann, translated by Nick Caister and Lorenzo Garcia and published by Pushkin Press. And finally, Bindu by Chris Barnard, translated by Michael Heinz and published by Alma Books. So 6 fantastic novels ranging in their the linguistic spread from Afrikaans to Albanian. And quite unusually, for the first time, we have 2 of them translated by pairs of translators, which raises very interesting questions, I think, about the nature of the craft and the effectiveness with which it could be done in collaboration. I thought that to begin with, we might just say a few words about each of the books and their particular qualities in the view of the judges. So possibly I could begin by asking Gabriel to talk about Dublinesque.
Yes, certainly. Hello. Some of you may have read other books by Villamatas. About 3, I think, have been translated into English. Dublinesque, to my mind, was much the best of his books. I've always enjoyed the others, but felt that they were amusing sort of jeu d'esprit. Whereas here I felt this was the book in a way that he'd really been wanting to write all his life. It's very rare, I think, to find a comic book, anyhow these days, to find a comic book that is profoundly serious. And I think that's one of them. We might talk a bit more about it later. I mean, the plot, for what it's worth, is the decision by the hero, who is a ex-publisher of a small press, to go to Dublin to celebrate or to mourn the death of literature, in a way, of the novel and the death of the printed book, the death of Gutenberg. But that is only the froth, as it were. Once one gets down to the coffee, there is quite a lot of it down below.
Thank you, Gabriel. Elif, would you perhaps like to say a little about Travel of the Century?
I was I'm very excited about this book. I read it with great admiration, to be honest, admiring both its style and the content. We read so many books, we read them very fast, but some books stay with us, you know, they leave an impact and they keep living with us. So it's one of those books for me. It's quite surreal in many ways. I loved the imagination in it. Very broadly, the story takes place in post-Napoleonic Germany, in which a traveler arrives at a town. But it's quite surreal, you know, the town both looks very magical and at the same time very familiar. It looks very out of this world, but it looks very mundane. You know, all of these things are woven very, very deftly, beautifully. It's a story of love. It's a story about loneliness. I think it's a story of journeys, both intellectual and spiritual. And one of the things I liked best about the book, it was the combination of this intellectual depth with there's an amazing emotional dimension there. You know, the heart and the mind is combined beautifully in the book. I was really very, very excited about The Traveller of the Century.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, maybe I could say something about The Detour, if that's okay. The Detour, which is by Gabriel, who is certainly not without international recognition. For instance, he won the overall Impact Prize for The Twin. This is an apparently very simple book. It's about a woman who goes absent from her own life. She is, in fact, she's a specialist in translation, significantly enough. And she flees her marriage, and she goes to rural Wales. And while she's there, she forms quite difficult but fascinating relationships with a couple of local people. There's a wonderful sense of the eerie strangeness of the Welsh mountains of Snowdonia, expressed in incredibly crisp yet resonant language, which I think is a test for the translation. I think it's one that David Colmer absolutely passes with all colours flying. It is a kind of thriller or chase novel in that we know that this woman is being pursued. And right until the end, we're not quite sure what the outcome will be. It's very mysterious. Its simple surface belies, I think, an enormous sense of crisis and turbulence underneath, all set against this wonderfully depicted landscape. So the sense of a spiritual crisis unfolding against a place which is absolutely rock solid, immovable, and unknowable as well. And if you read it, you'll find again, as Elif was saying, it's one of those books which does leave a very deep mark and which stays with you. So maybe we can go on to one of the other titles, maybe Bindu, would you like to say?
Yes, this was another book that I found very, very inspiring. And, you know, we were talking about this among ourselves. It's one of those books I would love to recommend to other people to read. It deals with a very, very heavy subjects, in fact, but it does it so lightly, with such modesty, that you sometimes rarely come across, you know, when you look at writers who deal with really colossal issues like famine, like hunger, like death. People suffering, people seeing, you know, the death of their children. The story takes place in Africa, and it concentrates on the lives of people who are there for humanitarian reasons. And they are not portrayed as heroes at all. And I think that's one of the things I liked best about the book. I mean, obviously what they are doing there is quite heroic, but the approach wasn't like that. Every individual in the book is depicted as a human being with their conflicts, with their mistakes, with their flaws, you know, true human beings of flesh and blood and mistakes and sins and errors and aspirations. So there's an amazing, you know, it's quite realistic. At the same time, it's beautifully romantic. All of these things are woven together beautifully. And as I said, I love the language. It's very clear, very crisp, and very, very modest, but at the same time it makes its issues very openly, it makes its points very openly. I was very excited to read Bindu, and it's again another book that stayed with me for a long time.
Thank you. Gabriel, the Cadare, for instance, would you like to?
Yes.
Yes, that's.
I suppose Cadare is the author on the short list that most people might be most familiar with. He has written, you know, quite a number of books, all of which I think are interesting, special to himself, special to Albania. They're light in texture, but always deal with very, very serious topics. And this one's no exception. Actually, it's the book of his that I've preferred. I don't think it's quite the step up, as it were, that the Villa Matas was, but again, very, very difficult book to summarize or to tell you what it's about, because it deals with the deepest and most difficult subjects in Albanian history, the Nazi occupation, the communist takeover, and yet it does it through an anecdote about two doctors who happen to have the same name. And it's a sort of book that you can coast along with and read and enjoy, and then suddenly you think, actually, there's more going on than you thought. And I think it really is the kind of book that you get to the end of, and you suddenly think, oh, all right, and you want to start right back at the beginning again. So books that demand to be read twice, once immediately after the other, are rare enough, and I think that, you know, this is certainly one of them.
Thank you, Gabriel. I'll just say something about the last book on our list, Trieste by Dasha Derndic. And it was, in a way, only after we'd decided the shortlist that I realized that in terms of dealing with the tragic outcomes and aftermaths of the Second World War, Trieste is almost the polar opposite to Cadare. Cadare is this wonderfully light and gnomic fabulist. Dasha Derndic, writing about one of the many, but a specifically horrible Nazi policy in the occupied areas of northern Italy, which was essentially the snatching of children to be raised as Aryans in a program that was called the Lebensborn program, and this policy of this kind of doomed and, of course, totally stupid policy of raising a racial elite. Doomed and stupid because at that time and in that place, the boundaries between kind of who was Aryan and who was Jewish and who was mixed were, of course, extremely blurred, which is part of the point of the entire plot. But the motor of the action is many, many decades after the event, a mother attempting to find the child that she lost. And at the opposite extreme from Cadare's mode of parable, almost, it's a novel which is full of documentary detail, which is full of research, which is full of this anguished quest to find out the truth about this appalling infliction and what it did to families. At the same time, I think pursued with a very high level of sort of linguistic intensity and concentration. But at the same time, the way that it negotiates this historical documentary material really does raise the most profound questions about the borderland between fiction and non-fiction, and also the ethics of how the novelist can hope to do justice with events so tragic and so devastating, whose consequences we are still living with. So that, for instance, at one point, you will find that the narrative breaks down into a list of Jews deported from this area of northern Italy and Western Croatia, what is now Western Croatia, Slovenia, to the Nazi camps. In a way, a kind of a complete taboo-busting assault on the conventions of fiction. But one which, in a way, also forces you to realize that any novelist who undertakes a serious attempt to recreate and to fictionalize these events really sets to him or herself the most profound challenges, both in the ethical and in the artistic spheres. And I think it is that challenge which the novel is perpetually aware of, and I think deals with enormous honesty and passion. So anyway, so that is our shortlist. I think it's a fantastic array of novels. As before with this prize, there is, I think, something for almost every kind of fiction reader. There is no pattern, there is no particular dominant strain in what we have chosen, but then there never is. But I just wanted to ask my fellow judges whether the whole experience of reading the entire range of submissions for our shortlist had given them any particular predominant impression. Was there any specific theme that came to the fore? Was there any sense of a recurrent question being posed by the books that we read? Elif?
I mean, right from the beginning, from the first moment onwards, what I enjoyed observing was the amazing diversity of styles and themes coming from very, very different parts of the world, obviously. But then, as you said, there are also certain patterns, not patterns maybe, but themes that I can see different writers have dealt with in different ways. But the themes, the subjects are common. Several come to mind immediately. One, of course, we will never tire of writing about love and maybe love triangles. This was one theme that kept coming up. Another theme was writers writing about writers. So we found lots of writers within the stories we have read. But to be honest, one thing that struck me was how heavy is the responsibility of memory and amnesia, both for individuals, also because I come from Turkey. It's a question that's of interest to me. It's a subject that I care about a lot. And it was amazing for me to see in very different contexts how individuals deal, both with their individual pasts, how do you deal with forgetting, how do you deal with memory, the burden of memory, and also for collectivities, for nationalities. And I think that's another theme that is going to stay with us for a very, very long time in the literary world.
Yeah. Gabriel?
Can I take a slightly different line on this? I think we've got a wonderful short list, and we had some interesting books on the long list. But the thing that struck me very forcibly reading through this mass of novels was, in a way, that I felt there was a reluctance, perhaps, on the part of publishers to publish really adventurous work. A lot of the work was very run-of-the-mill, fairly interesting, but, no more than that. Now, it could be, of course, that, there's never in any one period, there are never more than a very few writers who are really, really interesting. And we are, I just feel that there's an awful lot of hype that gets associated with the book world, that every book that comes out is hyped as a masterpiece, as the greatest. And I found this extremely tiresome, having these books coming at me, all with the same kind of lavish praise on them, and so many of them I felt really not deserving it.
Yeah. Elif, did you feel that the overall standard of what you were reading was up to scratch? Was it sufficient, given in particular that, of course, for any book to be translated in the UK it has to pass through various hurdles that people have to think it's really worthwhile as a project, and possibly the bar is set higher than it would be for work in English. So bearing that in mind, did you feel that the overall standard was what you expected?
For us writers coming from very different parts of the world, I think one of the disappointments that we experience over and over again, it's like a one-way street. When a novel, when a short story collection is published in France, in England, in Italy, in different countries throughout the Western world, very quickly it is being translated into Turkish. And I'm not claiming that it's being printed in huge numbers, but for the avid reader, for someone who is curious and eager to read, find that book, the book is out there. All you need to do is just go to the bookstore and buy it. But that is a one-way street, isn't it? I mean, when a book is published in Turkish, in Arabic, in Persian, the opposite is not true. That is why this fiction prize is so important. It's so different. It just stands out. I agree with what Gabriel said. I mean, there's so many voices out there, very courageous perhaps, very experimental, very, very open to new ideas, new styles, and how much of that is being translated, how much of that the publishers dare to translate and publish, it's a big question mark. Unfortunately, I think, and maybe this could be one of the questions we could discuss if we have time, there is also identity politics in the literary world. So who you are, where you're coming from, the labels and the tags attached to you as a writer matter a lot. So we're not talking solely about the quality of the writing. I'm talking about the general situation, but also who the writer is. I find this very, very limiting. And I also it's like a double standard, because we tend to attribute a function to fiction nowadays. When we buy a book, we want to learn what is that book going to teach me about that particular country. If I'm going to read a book by an Afghan writer, I want to learn the Afghan reality. We have reduced fiction to something else, to identity politics. And I have a problem with that.
I couldn't agree more strongly. And it's worth bearing in mind that on our shortlist, we have a Dutch novel set in Wales and a Spanish novel set in Ireland. Which is absolute proof that just in the same way that we expect major British novelists to write about Turkey or South Africa or India or whatever, so equally the imagination is in no sense limited by borders. You will go to these books, yes, for an understanding to some extent of the culture that bred them, but also of an understanding of just how strongly the novelist's imagination can overcome all borders. And just to take another example, Traveller of the Century by an Argentinian writer who now lives in Spain, but recreating the world of Germany and Central Europe in the 19th century. Again, these are not native informants telling you solely about their tribal customs. That they are people whose imagination spans the world.
Yes, well, I think it is a fact that these are the ones on the shortlist, and I couldn't agree more with what Elif has said. Too often people think of novels as a short way of getting into history. None of the novels, including the one that is most, as Boyd was saying, problematic in its exploration of the area between reality and fiction, that is the one dealing with Slovenia and Italy during the war, none of them can be reduced to books that are going to tell us the history of this or that part. They're all imaginative works which really think of the novel as being, in a way like a poem, something which has its own intensity, and that from first word to last, it is something that actually should hold the reader as it has been made. They're made works. And too often I felt with a lot of the works which we dropped fairly soon was that one didn't feel so much that they were made as that they were, nice stories which were nicely told, and that was it.
Thanks. And what about, after all, the other distinguishing feature of this prize is that it's split entirely equally between the original author and the translator, which means, of course, that we are looking for great novels in great translations. And I wondered whether my fellow judges felt that the quality of the translation was, on the whole, high enough to satisfy their expectations. Did you feel that the professional, the literary professional standard that was being reached was consistently high? Elif,
in that sense, the whole experience was so important to me. It was amazing to see sometimes books that are obviously very well written, beautiful, however not very well translated, or vice versa. And it's the harmony, the dance, those two contributions coming together is so important. I saw it once again, how much we owe to our translators. And of course there's a huge imbalance, isn't there? I mean, we always talk about the novelist, it's the novelist's name that are put on the book jacket in bigger letters. But to be honest, I mean, I know so many books that are not so good in the original and they're much better in the translated versions, because we always say that things are lost in translation, but things are also gained in translation. So many things are added in translation. So it was amazing for me to see sometimes, when the translation is not good enough, the book is not alive, it's not breathing anymore.
Yes, I felt that on the whole, the level actually of translation, even of books that were less interesting, was, remarkably high. So many of them, one didn't feel one was reading a translation. One felt one was reading the book itself. I was very, very cheered by the sense that, there are an awful lot of, very, very good, dedicated translators around. Of course, we are set an impossible task with this prize. I think it's a wonderful prize. I think that, it's completely impossible for judges, in a sense, to be judging this prize, in that how many of us have, Chinese, Turkish, Finnish, etc. Well, we had to look at books in, all those languages, and we were lucky occasionally to have a Turkish speaker or to have a German speaker or a Spanish one. So it is a matter of instinct, and I think it's quite possible that there were some wonderful translators at work who are not going to be recognized because we didn't feel that the work that they had translated was itself sufficient to really grab our interest. I don't think it works the other way around.
Yes, it was, I think it was Umberto Eco who said that The Name of the Rose, as written by the late William Weaver, was a better novel than The Name of the Rose as written by Umberto Eco. And when you're Umberto Eco, you can afford to say things like that, I think. But obviously, translation is, as it were, the magic key to this entire process. And it's maybe something we can talk about, that obviously there's always a lively debate in the translation world about whether, as it were, invisibility is the ultimate ideal for translation, or should, in some sense, translation bear the mark, the trace of the process and of the journey that has been accomplished between the original language and the target language. Obviously, on the level of general readership, to say, oh, I didn't know I was reading a translation, is what people use as a compliment. And clearly, one doesn't want to stumble or to trip all the time. But at the same time, should there be some way in which translation marks its otherness, marks the fact that this text was not generated in English? I mean, it's a question which goes back and forth like a tennis match among translators, and maybe we can touch on it later. But there's one other question I wanted to raise, and then we can maybe have a more general discussion, which is that this prize achieves great things, and it reflects a fantastic array of the best in global fiction. But what it has never managed to reflect is any kind of gender balance.
Yes.
And once again, we have an unbalanced shortlist with one woman and 5 men. And this, over the years, this has been a pattern. And it certainly isn't for lack of a gender balance among the judges, which is always pretty much evenly divided. It is something to do with the books that get translated, I think. And I wondered, Elif, whether you might like to say something about that.
Yes, that's an issue that has been troubling me as well. I mean, 2 things. When we look at the genres, that we have on the table, there is also inequality there, because the novel obviously is very strong, very much on the forefront. But when it comes to short stories or experiments, those genres that kind of blur the fiction and non-fiction, they're a bit less in numbers, and we hear their voices less. But the biggest inequality, I think, as you pointed out, is this gender inequality. And why is that? It's a question that troubles me, because there's so many women novelists all over the world. I mean, in general, especially in this genre, there are many women producing. But more ironically, perhaps, I think most fiction readers are women. I mean, in my country, definitely they are. I would say 85% of fiction readers are women. And usually when I see a male reader, I don't want to make a huge sweeping generalization, but when I see a male reader, coming with a book to sign, I usually guess it is his girlfriend or his wife or his mother, some woman in his inner circle who recommended that book, and he's reading it as a result. So we are so passionate about books, we read books, we make this world so dynamic, but at the same time, our percentage is incredibly low. So that was, of course, it was disappointing for me to see it again and again. It keeps coming with us, it doesn't change fast.
Yeah, so of course, what we can say, of course, is that although there might be still a deplorable imbalance among the authors in terms of gender, when it comes to the translators, of course, the women are extremely well represented. And in this year, as in many years for this prize, represent either more or less parity or else an absolute majority among the translators.
If I may add one thing, I mean, I'm just curious about this, because when I look at the books published, so many of them are written by women, but when I look at the books reviewed, very few of them are written by women. Likewise, as you said, many of them are, all around the world written by women writers, but those translated, again, the percentage drops. These 2 gaps between the reviewing, publishing, and the publishing and translation, both gaps keep coming with us.
Yes, yeah. One other thing I would like to add, which is takes us back to the question of genre, is that, of course, another not problem that this prize has, but another recurrent issue it has is that every year, for reasons that many of us will understand, a pretty high proportion of the total novels submitted in English translation are various kinds of crime writing. Of course, this is, in terms of the entire translated sector, one of the most consistently successful and lucrative areas. It's also one in which clearly women are very well represented. So I think the imbalance has to do more with the translation of what one is forced to call literary fiction, which is always a term that I detest. Because in the realms of commercial genre fiction, international crime writing prominent among them, women are doing perfectly well and are being translated and read and sold all over the world. I just wondered whether, before we open it up to a wider discussion, whether my judges felt that there was anything missing from their reading? Gabriel has mentioned that there wasn't quite as much in terms of the adventurous experiment with form as he might have liked to see. Elif, was there anything you missed? Anything you would have liked to have encountered more often or in a stronger form?
No, I think I very much agree with
Yes.
what Gabriel has said. I mean, Gabriel has said, but when I say experimental, not only, you know, in terms of style or language, but the subjects we deal with, the themes we deal with, the connections we make, the way we travel throughout centuries and different space. I think that is becoming less and less, and that's something that worries me. I mean, I would have loved to see more of that. Maybe that's one of the reasons why I was so excited to read The Traveller of the Century, because I saw it there. You know, but that is not a common trend in world literature today.
Yes, I'm not sure. I suppose that, you know, we did have some books that did seem to be experimental in form. It wasn't quite what I had in mind. I mean, I think, for instance, of some of the work, if we go back, you know, a few years, to a woman writer who used to be translated into English and then stopped being. I mean, she's died, Marguerite Duras. You know, these are very short novels. They're realistic, if you like, but, you know, they are in a way challenging because, you know, there's very little description, there's very little plot, but they are, to me, immensely exciting, far more page turners than, you know, the latest thriller. So I'm very unhappy with those kinds of divisions, that there's either, you know, experimental books which are going to have to be formally innovative, or they're going to be old and traditional. I think it's just a sense that there are books, that there must be a lot of books that are being published in other countries which are perhaps shorter than is expected in England, that are perhaps just more difficult to place in a particular category, which publishers are unwilling to take a chance on, which perhaps, you know, it is the English public that needs somehow to be educated, and how better to educate them than through, you know, the best of foreign writing, as this prize does try to encourage.
Yes, that's. I just wanted to say a little about the geographical spread, and I've long since given up trying to extrapolate general historic trends from one year's submissions to this prize. What you can say this year is that I think the literature of Central and Eastern Europe has been very well represented. We have Croatian and Albanian writers on the shortlist. Conversely, it has been a less stellar year than sometimes previously for instance, the literature of East Asia, which one would expect to be, to some extent, booming at the moment. However, this year I noticed that there are a considerably larger number of Chinese authors being published in Britain, and of course China was the market focus at the book fair last year, so maybe next year there will be more Turkish authors. These things depend on rhythms which are not always going to tell you much about the overall strength of literature in any particular geographical region. I do have a recurrent regret that so little is published in this country that is translated from the other languages of the Indian subcontinent apart from English. I think it's a major lack in our publishing, particularly when you bear in mind that in India many of these translations are available. So it's a problem of distribution, at least as much as a problem of commissioning the translations in the first place. And I would hope that in future years this can be addressed in some way. Having said that, of course, we on the shortlist we have a tremendous spread from, as I said, from Afrikaans to Albanian and Spanish. consistently strong with two novels on the shortlist. This again has been a recurrent picture over recent years with the Spanish fiction of both Spain itself and of Latin America being very forcefully represented in the global literary marketplace over the past couple of decades. But as I said, the one feels that the coverage is not complete, that there are still areas of our map of what is being translated that are, if not blank, at least very sketchily filled in. And I would like to see that change.
Can I say, in addition to that, that I was surprised by the number of Scandinavian authors we had. I mean, huge and surprisingly large numbers of very exciting and dull and, you know, the whole wide range. Very short and very long, done by smaller presses and large presses. And clearly what one would like is for that to be happening in other parts of the world. As you say.
It could be that because of the perceived success and attraction of Scandinavian fiction across the board, from mass market genre to high literary endeavor, that with those languages we are closer to seeing a full picture of what is being published, or something approaching a full picture, than from virtually anywhere else in the world. And it will be nice to have that same spectrum available in English from other languages and other cultures. However, maybe it's time to have some questions from the floor. So if you'd like to ask anything about the shortlist or the process that resulted in it, then please do just put up your hand. Yes, there.
Hold on, there's a mic coming,
Yes,
I think.
Yes, you mentioned from Afrikaans to Albanian, but there's another language beginning with A that was very much in vogue, which was Arabic, which was a market focus. And I know there was an Arabic title on the long list, In Praise of Hatred by Khalid Khalifa. Now people keep saying, how is the Arab Spring being reflected in literature? But from what you're saying, this may be a wrong question, but I'd have thought that long-listed book does shed quite a lot of light on Syria in an earlier conflict and on Syria now.
Yes, yes. The question is about one of our long-listed titles, Khalid Khalifa, In Praise of Hatred, which I would warmly recommend. Really, an insight into the Syria of the senior Assad's dictatorship. It's interesting that about 3 or 4 years ago, we had 3 Arabic titles on our long list, and so that a certain number of books are being published. You have very interesting ventures in the Arabic literary scene, such as the Man Booker, sorry, the International Prize for Arabic Fiction, which takes place under the aegis of the Booker Foundation. But the whole question about contemporary history and how it finds its way into fiction is, of course, a very vexed one, because it could be that it might be a decade before we have the great novel of the Arab Spring. That novelists are not slot machines. You can't feed in the coin of historical change and expect to get a neatly packaged fictional representation out the other end in a year or two. These things happen indirectly and sometimes quite mysteriously. Would you agree, Gabriel?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that, as I was saying, I think all the books on our shortlist are books that I would say transcend. Other people might say simply don't reflect individual countries. A lot of people do go to fiction as a way of, finding out about things like the Arab Spring. My own feeling is, why would one want to have a fictionalized plot around something where, it might be better to read, certainly in the short run, maybe after 20, 30 years, but in the short run, to read a journalist or a contemporary historian.
I think it was First of all, I think you're very right. You know, we don't have, this year particularly, we didn't have too many writers, not only Arabic speaking, but Persian speaking, Turkish speaking. In general, from the Muslim world, we didn't have too many writers making the long list, and then obviously the short list. But I think it was Doris Lessing who said that literature was analysis after the event. You know, you sometimes need time and distance. Distance is so important. When you're too much inside something, to write about it, especially to write a work of fiction about it, and I think this is a general feature all over the world, is really, really very hard. And in my country, it's only now that we are dealing and we are writing about the military takeover of 1980. How many years have passed, right? But we couldn't do it. Only now movies are dealing with the legacy of the military takeover and what it has done to the country. So it really, really takes time for huge social transformations to be reflected in fiction, not in non-fiction. In non-fiction, I think the span is shorter, but for fiction, it really requires time and distance, some kind of distance.
Yes, thanks. Do we have another question? Yes, that's...
Can I quickly ask, mainly I think probably to Boyd Tonkin, you mentioned the absence, the continued chronic absence of translations of South Asian, Indian subcontinent fiction published in this country. Do you see any ways through that? Because there's an enormous amount of sometimes very good translations being published in India, in Pakistan. They almost don't get to bookshops here. They don't reach publishers here. How is that wall going to be broken? Is there some way of the Independent Foreign Fiction Prize recommending one or two titles that actually it can't be considered because they were published outside the country?
Well, that's an extremely interesting idea. Could we, obviously, like any prize, we are to some degree passive in that we depend on what is published in Britain in the preceding calendar year. It would be another stage to move from that position to saying, well, these are the books we think should have been published in Britain, and which would, of course, would require a degree of research and resources that I'm not sure that just at the moment we could command. But in an ideal world, it would be an excellent thing to do. In other words, we would be saying both, here are the best translated novels of 2012, and here is a list of what you're missing. Which might at least put the wind up a few publishers and inspire them to possibly be a bit more proactive about looking for things that they ought to be on their list. Of course, a related question about that is how long it sometimes takes for really good international novels to ultimately find their way into an English translation. In the case, as you know, of one of our very few novels from the Indian subcontinent, Chauringi by Shankar, the Bengali writer. We put that on the shortlist in, I think, 2009. It had been published in Bengali in 1962. Now, given that this is a prize for living authors, we were really pushing it. Luckily, the author was sprightly and very active, and in fact came to London for publication. But I think when you're leaving a 50-year hiatus between original publishing and translation, you really are running the risk that the author simply will not be around for you to celebrate. Can we have another question? That's.
In that situation, would the translator get the full amount, the author's share too?
Well, I think in that situation, to be pedantic about it, the book would not be eligible unless the author was alive at the time of publication. Actually, in the very early days of this prize in its revised form, we did have a notable and a rather tragic example of the author being alive at the time of publication, but not at the time of the award, which of course was Max Sebald's Austerlitz. I mean, let's hope that that situation never occurs again. Do we have another
we did have
yes,
a slight example of that with Saramago's early novel, which we received as judges, and at the same time as we read, you know, his obituaries. So we were then told, keep the book, but I'm sorry, it's not eligible.
Yes. That's. Yes. That's.
Hello. Hello. Which book were you most sorry to lose when it came to choosing the shortlist?
Oh, now this is the question that opens up a can of worms. which is our favourite absentee from the shortlist? And if my fellow judges are willing to play, I am happy to mention one novel on the assumption that they can both mention one other novel. Is that
one novel?
Yes, yeah. I mean, I can go first if you like. Okay. Well, obviously it's invidious because there are many, but from my point of view, and luckily he will have several other bites at this cherry because of the serial nature of the project. But the first volume of Karl Ove Knausgaard's sequence, the first volume is called A Death in the Family. However, there are 5 more to come.
I guess I was sorry to lose Black Bazaar. Yeah, I had liked its inventiveness, its language.
Alain
Mabanku's novel, which takes place in France, but it's a very different Paris. We're reading about the subcultures, the inventiveness, the humor in the book, the characters. I really like the style. But if I may add this very, very quickly, it's amazing, isn't it? I mean, at the end of the day, as you said at the beginning, everything is very subjective. What we think is the best, what we think should make the short list. At the end of the day, there are no recipes, no golden formulas. Certainly, there are things we all share, but it's an individual discovery. So I would really highly recommend also the books on the long list, not only the ones on the short list.
I don't think I want to go down this road, but instead I'd like to say something I wanted to say earlier about translation and what we are reading when Boyd was talking, and then we moved on to something else, which is that in the Gerbrand Bakker novel, what we are presented with is an Emily Dickinson poem in English at the beginning and an Emily Dickinson poem in Dutch at the end, which I thought was extraordinarily effective. The effort I had to make to understand the Dutch made me think harder about the poem. And I just wondered if we had had the original, whether it would have had the poem in reverse order, in Dutch at the beginning and in English at the end. I certainly don't think it would have been in this order, and I think the translators to be commended for that. I thought it was the kind of, little unobtrusive decision which translators have to make all the time, which I felt was, absolutely spot on.
Thanks. Is there another question? Okay. Well, thank you very, very much for coming. I really do hope that you go away and read the entire shortlist, because it will give you a fantastic package of fictional experiences, especially if you're going on holiday, for instance. The absolute gamut of what can be achieved in contemporary global fiction. And I'd like to thank my fellow judges, Elif, Shafak and Gabriel Josipovici, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day and the rest of the fair. Thank you.
Thank you.